She thought she was just helping a ragged stranger pay his bus fare. But the man she saved was no ordinary drifter. He was a fallen legend in hiding. Vanished from headlines, hunted by power, betrayed for telling the truth. Now the city that judged him is about to feel what it means to be seen. One girl's quiet kindness just reignited a storm no one saw coming. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. Atlanta at noon shimmered in sunlight, but brightness did little to soften the cold that lived in its corners. The kind of cold that didn't come from wind or weather, but from stares, silence, and sidestepping truths no one wanted to admit. The city bustled, loud with traffic, hurried footsteps, and overheard conversations. Yet somehow it still managed to feel distant. Everyone had somewhere to be. Everyone had something to ignore. Raina knew how to move through it. At 17, she had learned the rhythm of indifference. Her sneakers scraped the sidewalk as she clutched a brown paper bag of donated groceries to her chest, her headphones tucked into her hoodie though no music played. She liked the illusion of being tuned out. It made it easier to avoid the eyes that didn't see her, or worse, the ones that did, and looked away. She stepped around a construction cone as a man in a delivery uniform bumped her shoulder without so much as a glance back. No apology. Just a muttered something under his breath that sounded a lot like a slur, twisted into casual irritation. She didn't flinch, just kept walking, the coins in her hoodie pocket jingling softly with each step. 70 cents in change, bus fare still out of reach. She passed a coffee shop window where laughter bounced through the glass. Inside, a group of women sat at a round table, their nails long, lashes longer, and skin pale as the whipped foam on their lattes. One of them pointed at the window. Raina saw her reflection in the glass beside the pointing finger and heard the muffled sound of laughter. She didn't stop. She'd seen the game before. Ahead, near the curb, a man crumpled, mid-stride, knees buckling, his hands failing to catch the weight of his fall. A sharp gasp escaped from a nearby mother, who yanked her young son closer, shielding him as though the man had a disease that could jump through air and intention. He lay there for a moment, a groan low in his throat, barely audible over the buzz of a passing scooter and the honking horn of a delivery truck. A businessman in a navy suit stepped over him, careful not to wrinkle his slacks. No one helped. Raina slowed, her body already tensed with the familiar war between instinct and fear. She looked around. There were too many eyes, but none that would do anything. After a second, the man rolled to his side and dragged himself upright against a trash can, his breathing jagged, sweat beading on his forehead. He leaned back, defeated, eyes closed like he had already accepted that today wasn't the day someone would treat him like a person. Raina exhaled and moved on. The bus stop was 4 blocks down, tucked between a boarded-up pharmacy and a corner store with bulletproof glass at the register. She could already see the line forming, an older woman in church clothes, a pair of teenage boys arguing about sneakers, a man with too many bags and not enough shoes. Raina walked slower now. Timing mattered. If she got there too early and the bus took long, the stares would start. She paused at the crosswalk, then glanced to her right. Sitting slumped against the metal bench, his body too big for the narrow seat, was a man who looked more like a collapsed building than a person. Broad shoulders hunched under a thick, worn hoodie, his jeans dirtied and frayed at the cuffs. He didn't beg, didn't move, just sat, staring at his feet. He was black, too. That much was clear. But even in a city full of black bodies, his presence felt unwelcome. Raina could see it in the way people gave him extra space, not out of respect, out of discomfort. She stepped back from the curb and leaned against a light pole. Watched him. He didn't speak, didn't look up, but something about him was off. Not wrong, just not what it looked like on the surface. His hands were massive, scarred, with fingers that twitched slightly as if recalling something they used to hold. A basketball, maybe, or grief. Behind her, the sound of a woman's voice rose, frustrated, shrill, laced with that blend of fear and disdain. They really should keep people like that away from public transit. The words weren't directed at anyone in particular, but they landed with precision. A few heads nodded. The 2 teen boys muttered something under their breath and laughed. Raina felt her stomach tighten. She crossed her arms, the brown paper bag warming against her chest, as the heat from the day pressed down on everything. The man still didn't move, didn't react. His silence, in a way, was louder than all the murmurs around him. The bus arrived 2 minutes late, wheezing to a stop like it was just as tired of this city as everyone else. As people filed in, Raina reached into her pocket and counted again. 70 cents. She could add a few from the bottom of her bag, maybe get close enough to plead with the driver. As she stepped up, her eyes drifted back to the man on the bench. He hadn't moved, but the driver didn't wait. The door opened. Her moment was now. Raina looked once more at the ragged figure by the bench, and something unspoken passed between them, though his eyes never rose. He hadn't asked for help, but somehow he'd still needed it. And somewhere deep inside her, Raina already knew. This city didn't deserve kindness, but sometimes you gave it anyway. She climbed aboard, and behind her she heard the heavy drag of worn shoes follow. The hiss of the bus brakes had barely faded when Raina stepped aside, letting the older woman board first. Her grocery bag pressed tighter against her ribs as she watched the rest of the line shuffle forward with practiced impatience. Behind her, the man from the bench had risen slow, like it cost him something, and now stood at the edge of the curb, looming but still like a statue carved out of fatigue and silence. He was enormous, not just tall but wide, with shoulders that looked like they had once carried weight far heavier than this city's scorn. His hoodie, a faded charcoal with the edge of an old sports logo barely visible on the chest, hung over him like a veil. His head was bowed, his hands buried deep in the front pocket. People didn't just avoid him, they recoiled. A mother near the back of the line shifted her son behind her like a human shield. A man in slacks took one look and moved to the other side of the sidewalk, pretending to be on the phone. One woman coughed dramatically and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "I'm not trying to catch no street disease today." Raina heard it all. Every bitter assumption, every whispered label. She stayed where she was, her spot in line now passed up by at least 3 people who had no interest in standing near him. And still he said nothing. Not a word, not a sound. He stared at the ground like it was sacred, like it was the only thing that didn't ask questions or flinch. There was something in his silence that unnerved people more than shouting would have. He didn't argue, didn't defend, and that made them hate him more. There's a certain kind of rage that only silence provokes, the kind that dares people to look inward, and most aren't ready for that kind of confrontation. Raina studied him, unsure why she couldn't look away. There was a shadow over his face from the hood, but she could make out his profile. A worn jawline, cracked lips, skin that looked parched from too many sunlit days and cold nights. And his eyes, they weren't dull like the eyes of most street-sitters. They were alert beneath the weight of years, glinting in brief flickers like coals that hadn't fully died out. He didn't seem high, didn't smell like alcohol, didn't sway or mutter. He just stood there watching pavement, not people. That quiet focus, that unnatural stillness in such a massive frame, made him seem less like a broken man and more like a wounded lion in the middle of traffic. The driver glanced up, his eyes flicking from the man's size to his clothes. "Need fare," he barked, not bothering to direct it at anyone in particular. The giant said nothing, didn't even look up. That's when the whispers changed tone. "Probably a junkie," someone muttered behind Raina. "Or an ex-con on the run," said another, a middle-aged man, whose suit had too much shine and whose breath smelled like coffee and bitterness. Raina clenched her jaw. The man hadn't moved, hadn't asked for anything, and still, they built whole stories around him. Dangerous ones, ugly ones. She watched him shift his weight slightly, a subtle movement, but enough to show he was listening to every word. Then without thinking, she took one step forward and turned toward the payment box. She tapped her card twice. 2 beeps, 2 fares. She didn't say it was for him, didn't turn to look, but she felt the change in the air around her. Stiff, confused, irritated. Someone scoffed loudly. Another whispered something about bleeding hearts. But the driver grunted a reluctant go and motioned the man on. The ragged giant stepped up. His footsteps were thunder but without threat. He passed her without brushing against her, his head still low. As he climbed the steps, his body seemed to shrink just slightly, like the moment was a kind of surrender. But as he passed, she caught a glimpse of his face. Just for a second. And in that moment, time folded. She didn't recognize the face, not in any obvious way. But there was a pull, an unspoken familiarity that brushed the edge of memory. It wasn't a face she'd seen, but a feeling she knew. Dignity weathered by humiliation. Strength disguised as silence. It unsettled her. He took the very back seat, knees spread wide, hands clasped between them. He stared out the window with the same intensity he had shown the sidewalk. The bus began to move. Raina sat 3 rows ahead. She glanced back once. He hadn't looked at her. No thank you. No nod. No tearful gratitude. Just stillness. A kind of presence that felt ancient and out of place on a public bus. And yet, it made perfect sense. Behind her, the same voices resumed. Conversations about office drama. Weekend barbecues. Gas prices. As if the moment had already passed. But not for Raina. She stared ahead, her fingers gripping the bag in her lap. Her mind raced, not with panic, but with something slower, something harder to name. That man was no ordinary stranger. And she had the creeping sense that she hadn't just given away a bus fare. She had stepped into something much larger. The bus rattled as it moved through the artery of Midtown, groaning around every bend, the windows dusty with 1,000 fingerprints, and the seats marked by time. Inside, the air was thick with that stale blend of body heat, worn fabric, and city exhaust. Raina sat near the middle, her grocery bag in her lap, the plastic beginning to stretch under the weight of dented cans and a half loaf of donated bread. Her eyes weren't on the window or her phone or the people around her. They were fixed on nothing, floating somewhere between tension and thought. She could feel the heat behind her where the ragged man had settled. 3 rows back, pressed into the rear corner like he was trying to disappear into the scratched plastic seat. He hadn't spoken, not once, not to her, not to the driver, not even to the world that stared at him like he was a mistake that hadn't yet been cleaned up. When she'd tapped her card for him, without planning, without knowing she had just spent her final transit credit, there had been a pause. The kind of pause that came with being watched. Not because people cared, but because people always took notice when someone broke the unspoken rules of judgment. You weren't supposed to help people like him. Not publicly, not without explanation. Especially not if you were black and young and broke yourself. But she had. And when he passed her on the steps, something had cracked open. She replayed the moment in her mind, not because it was dramatic. There were no gasps, no dramatic gestures, but because of how simple it was. He had looked up, just once. A flicker of movement from a face that had seemed carved in stone. His eyes had found hers, and what she saw wasn't gratitude in the traditional sense. It wasn't the look of someone rescued. It was something more haunted, more intimate. The look of someone who hadn't been seen in so long that recognition itself felt like pain. His eyes had glistened in that brief contact, but he hadn't cried. No tears, no tremble in the lip. His jaw was set like concrete, but his pupils dark, deep, bottomless, held something ancient. She couldn't explain it, but it stayed with her. The rest of the passengers acted as if nothing had happened. That was the city's way. The ones who had judged him before now turned their heads to stare at safer things. Billboards outside the window, notifications on their phones, empty space. A couple of teenage boys chuckled at a meme they shared on one of their screens, while a man in a maintenance uniform leaned back and muttered about traffic to no one in particular. No one mentioned the payment. No one asked her why she'd done it. But their silence had weight. The kind of weight that didn't rest. It pressed. It accused. Raina shifted in her seat, checking her phone again even though she had no service. No notifications. No distractions. The screen lit up with the cracked wallpaper of her and her younger brother at the community pool from 2 summers ago, before their mother left for Detroit, before the bills piled up, before the weight of survival landed squarely on her uncle's shoulders and slowly on hers too. The bus turned a corner, the windows flaring briefly with sunlight. For a moment, everything outside looked golden. Even the broken sidewalks and overgrown curbs seemed beautiful in that filtered light. But the illusion passed quickly. She reached into her pocket and fingered the remaining coins. Dimes, pennies, nothing close to bus fare. That tap for the man had emptied her card. She knew it. She'd known it before she even stepped up, but she hadn't hesitated. Not out loud. Behind her, the man hadn't moved. She could feel it. Not even a shuffle of feet. He was still, coiled in thought or memory, or maybe nothing at all. Maybe this was just what it looked like when someone waited for the world to prove them right, that no one cared. But Raina did. And she didn't have a good reason why. It wasn't pity. She knew pity. She'd tasted it in the hallway glances at school, the way counselors spoke to her with soft words and empty eyes. No, this was something different. It was empathy, the real kind. The kind that wasn't loud or photogenic or ready to be hashtagged. The kind that acted not because of applause, but because something inside refused not to. The driver slowed at a red light, and Raina caught a glimpse of herself in the window's reflection. Lips pressed tight, eyes steady. She looked older than 17 in that moment, like someone who had lived more years than she'd ever counted. In the row across from her, an older white woman shifted her purse closer, subtly angling it away from the aisle. 2 seats ahead, a man looked back quickly toward the rear of the bus, his eyes landing on the giant in the hoodie. Then, as if realizing he'd looked too long, he turned forward again and pulled his collar up. The judgment never stopped, it just shifted shape. Raina exhaled slowly and glanced out the window again. The city kept moving. Traffic, pedestrians, vendors setting up on corners. Nothing had changed, yet somehow, everything had. That man, whoever he was a question she hadn't asked but had already answered. And that answer carried weight. As the bus rolled toward the next stop, she felt a strange calm settle over her. Not because anything was resolved, not because she felt heroic, but because she'd made a choice, and that choice didn't need to be explained. Behind her, the ragged man finally moved, just a shift of his head. He looked out the opposite window, his reflection nearly invisible in the grime. But Raina noticed one thing before she turned away. He was watching the same city, but with different eyes. The apartment was hotter than it should have been. The old box fan in the window clicked with every turn, useless against the thick summer air trapped between peeling walls and creaking floorboards. Raina shut the door behind her, slipped off her sneakers and padded across the scuffed linoleum toward the living room, her grocery bag rustling like dry leaves in her arms. Her uncle's voice met her halfway. "Don't make no damn sense. Man like that don't just disappear." Darryl sat on the edge of the couch, one hand gripping the TV remote like he could squeeze answers out of it, the other waving toward the screen as if CNN might respond. A half-drunk bottle of ginger ale balanced on the armrest, and his t-shirt clung to him with sweat. On the television, a breaking news banner crawled across the bottom of the screen in red and white. NBA legend Shaquille O'Neal missing. FBI joins search. Photos flashed in rapid succession. Press conference snapshots, charity events, a viral video from a year ago of Big Shaq hugging a crying boy outside a fire-damaged school. Each image was framed with the same rhetoric spoken in tightly modulated news anchor voices. Concerns for his mental health, a history of high-risk investments, questions surrounding financial integrity. Raina froze, her eyes locking on the image of Shaq's face as it filled the screen. It was recent, a year maybe less. His beard grayer, eyes heavier, but still recognizable. Still proud, still standing tall. "Somebody did this to him," Darryl muttered, not taking his eyes off the screen. "You watch they gon' twist it, make it like he went crazy or something. Always what they do to a strong black man when he stops playing ball and starts speaking truth." Raina moved slowly toward the kitchen, her mind no longer on canned soup or ramen noodles. She emptied the bag one item at a time, but her thoughts were back on the bus. Back on the man who hadn't spoken, hadn't begged, hadn't even met her eyes until that 1 second of quiet recognition. He was huge, broad. His hoodie had hung low over his face, but she remembered the way it had creased around his shoulders, thick with fabric, like the kind athletes wore. And there was a logo, worn but familiar. She couldn't place it before, but now it came rushing back. An old charity league Shaq had sponsored, Unity on the Block, it had said years ago. She turned to look back at the TV. They were replaying a clip from an interview. Shaq was laughing, somewhere in a community center gym, his hands resting on a kid's shoulders. The smile on his face wasn't the kind from commercials. It was real, the kind that felt earned, lived in. But then came the panel of experts. 3 faces, 2 white, 1 black, with a carefully trimmed beard and an academic voice. They were already spinning a narrative. You have to consider the pressure, the wealth. Sometimes these guys live larger than life and collapse under their own legacy. Darryl scoffed. They act like he's just another celebrity flake. They know damn well if he was white and missing, they'd call him a philanthropist in crisis, not a possible mental case. You hear the way they talk about him. Unstable, reckless. You'd think he blew up a bank. Raina didn't answer. She was too busy replaying everything from earlier. The way the man had avoided eye contact, the quiet rage in his stillness, the world's need to label him something dangerous or broken. And then she saw it again, clearer now in her mind. That hoodie, that exact same faded charcoal gray, the logo, the build, the silence. It wasn't just a resemblance. It was him. The man on the bus was Shaquille O'Neal. She leaned against the sink, gripping the edge to keep steady. It didn't make sense. Why would a billionaire be riding a city bus in a tattered hoodie, hiding behind silence? Why wouldn't he speak? Unless speaking was what had put him in danger. She thought about the rumors on the news, embezzlement, political enemies, whispers of something bigger, and she thought about his eyes, that glint of pain that had nothing to do with poverty and everything to do with betrayal. "He ain't missing," Darryl muttered, interrupting her thoughts. "He hiding, 'cause they after him, same way they always come for a black man when he stops being convenient. He was trying to do something real, build schools, invest in neighborhoods. Can't let that happen. That's when they start looking to dig up dirt." Raina turned toward the hallway, her steps slow, her thoughts racing. She opened the drawer near the couch and pulled out her old sketchpad, half filled with drawings she didn't show anyone. Faces mostly, observations from buses, trains, corners, people forgotten by everyone but her. She flipped through until she found a blank page, and without fully deciding why, began to draw. Not from memory exactly, but from feeling. The heavy frame, the slope of the hoodie, the depth in the eyes. Her pencil moved faster than usual, not with confidence but urgency. When she was done, she stared at the sketch. It wasn't perfect, but it was him. The news was now running surveillance footage. A gas station clip showing a figure in a hoodie walking past a blurred cashier. The timestamp was from 2 days ago, just blocks from where she'd boarded the bus. The anchor's voice returned. Federal authorities are considering the possibility that O'Neill may be suffering from a delusional episode or has gone into hiding to avoid legal scrutiny. Daryl shook his head. They don't want him back, not the real him. They want the version they can put on cereal boxes, the one that smiles and shuts up, not the one that builds something without asking permission. Raina closed the sketchbook and looked back at the screen. She didn't know where Shaq was going, but she knew one thing for sure. He wasn't lost. He was moving through the noise, silent and watching, just like he had on that bus, and whatever had brought him to this point hadn't broken him. It had only made him quieter and more dangerous. The gym was dead quiet, save for the occasional creak of settling beams and the distant wail of a siren drifting in from the city's edge. Dust floated like ghosts in the sunlight that pierced through shattered skylights, illuminating broken bleachers and scorched lines on a warped hardwood floor. The space had once echoed with sneakers and whistles, but now it echoed with something else: memory. Shaquille O'Neal sat near the center of the old court, his back against the base of a rusting basketball hoop. His hoodie, damp with sweat, clung to his shoulders as he stared into the silence, unmoving. The echo of a bouncing ball, his own once famous rhythm, seemed to haunt the space. But there was no ball, only ghosts. He didn't sleep much anymore, not because of the noise outside, but because of what lived inside. His mind replayed the same sequence of events over and over. The boardroom that smelled like fresh espresso and fear. The contract papers with clauses written in ink but soaked in betrayal. The polished smiles of investors who shook his hand while crafting his downfall. He remembered their coded language. It's about image, Shaquille. We love the outreach, but it's scaring off the right donors. You're a beloved icon. Let's keep it that way. When he refused to pull back from his plan, a self-funded school network for inner-city kids with full scholarship pipelines, no corporate branding allowed, they moved quickly. A quiet audit here, a conveniently leaked email there, rumors of erratic behavior, financial irregularities, mental instability. They had spun the narrative with surgical precision. One moment he was a global hero, the next he was unstable, reckless, a financial threat. The headlines hadn't needed to call him dangerous. They let the subtext do the work, and America knew how to read between those lines, especially when the man in the crosshairs was black, proud, and refused to shut up. Now, here he was. Not homeless. Hiding. The gym had once been a training ground for underfunded schools, a project he'd backed before the endorsements began to thin out. It had burned down a year ago in what police called an unfortunate electrical mishap. He hadn't believed that explanation then, and he sure as hell didn't believe it now. But no one asked his opinion anymore. Publicly, he didn't exist. Shaq leaned his head back against the pole, his eyes drifting up to the ceiling. Through the gaps in the roof, he could see blue sky. Somewhere out there, people were arguing about him, deciding his legacy in rooms he couldn't enter anymore. His phone had been shut off for weeks, his accounts frozen pending investigation. But his mind was clear. He wasn't delusional. He wasn't running from guilt. He was running from a lie too large to dismantle with a press release. And he remembered the moment it broke. A meeting with one of the venture heads he once trusted. A slick-talking executive who pitched community reinvestment while funneling money through offshore accounts. Shaq had confronted him, quietly, privately, but it was enough. Within a month, whispers started. His mental health, his spending, his past trauma, all painted with a brush dipped in racial suspicion. The most dangerous thing a black man can be in America isn't angry. It's aware. Shaq closed his eyes. The silence brought faces to the surface. His mother, Lucille, strong and grounded, her voice echoing in his bones. You don't need to be the loudest, just the realest. His daughter's laughter from a voicemail he couldn't access anymore. His own voice, once booming across arenas, now reduced to murmurs in the corner of forgotten places. But the silence didn't break him. It sharpened him. He wasn't just hiding. He was gathering. In the gym's back room, beneath a loose tile, he'd hidden a black duffel bag. Old hard drives, backup financial ledgers, recordings of meetings where the masks slipped. It wasn't enough to reclaim his image. He didn't care about that. He wasn't trying to be a brand again. He was trying to burn the lie down. He wasn't paranoid. He was hunted. A target marked not with red dots, but with silence, discrediting, erasure. The kind that doesn't make front-page news. The kind that buries a man while he's still breathing. He thought about the girl on the bus. Quiet, observant, didn't flinch, tapped her card like it was nothing, even though he saw her fingers trembling slightly. The way she looked at him, not with fear, not with disgust, but with something deeper. Recognition. He hadn't spoken, because words were dangerous now. Every phrase could be clipped, twisted. But he remembered that moment clearly. Her act was small, but in a world built on apathy, small kindnesses were rebellion. And rebellion was contagious. He wasn't sure where he'd go next. The media circus would only grow louder. They'd dig deeper. They already had reporters questioning his mental state on national television. He had seen that game play out before. Martin, Malcolm, Colin, different eras, same playbook. But Shaq had something they hadn't counted on. Time. He wasn't in a rush. He knew the truth always walked slower than the lie. But when it arrived, it hit harder. And the people who had watched him fall, some with sadness, most with satisfaction, wouldn't be ready for what came next. He stood slowly, towering even in the ruin. He walked to the edge of the court and placed his hand against a burned section of the wall where a mural once lived. It had shown kids from the neighborhood holding a ball together. Now only a few streaks of color remained, but the message was still there. He whispered it to himself, the words barely audible. They can bury a name, not the truth. Then, without a sound, Shaquille O'Neal disappeared into the daylight pouring through the open door. The sound of pencil on paper filled the small bedroom, the tip dragging slowly across the page, then pausing, hovering, before gliding again. Raina sat cross-legged on the mattress, her sketchbook resting on the bent fabric of a wrinkled comforter. Her lamp, too dim for her uncle's liking, cast long shadows across the room, giving the drawings a strange kind of life. The man's face took shape in layers. It wasn't an exact likeness. Her memory had already begun to soften the edges, but the essence was right. The heaviness in his jaw, the way his brow dipped like he was carrying the weight of the world and refusing to let it fall. His shoulders weren't just broad, they were burdened. She stared at the sketch long after she finished, biting her bottom lip. There was something in his silence that hadn't left her. She hadn't said a word to him. He hadn't spoken to her, but it felt like they'd exchanged a truth deeper than language. He hadn't looked through her. He'd seen her, and somehow in the seconds their eyes had locked, she felt like he knew what it meant to be tired at 17. Down the hall, Daryl had the news on again. The anchors had moved from updates to theories. Now they were bringing in body language experts to dissect old clips of Shaquille O'Neal, looking for signs that he'd been unraveling all along. Every paused frame was used like evidence in a quiet trial the public didn't realize they were attending. "See," the anchor said. "Notice the twitch in his right eye? Classic micro-expression of anxiety." Raina clicked off the sketch lamp and stood. It was too much. She needed air. The street outside buzzed with the same broken energy that filled the neighborhood after sundown. Sirens in the distance. The occasional bark of a dog through a chain-link fence. Tires screeching a little too fast around a corner. But this was home, and she knew its rhythm, even the jagged parts. She turned up the block toward the corner store, the one with the flickering red open sign and the candy aisle she'd been haunting since she was 10. She didn't need anything, but sometimes walking those fluorescent-lit aisles was the only thing that felt stable. Inside, the cold hit her first, the air conditioning humming over the ceiling tiles. Then came the sound of the register beeping, a radio playing something faint and old-school from the back. A white cop stood near the freezer door, sipping coffee out of a plastic lid and pretending to check his phone. His eyes, though, weren't pretending. They locked on her the moment she stepped in. Raina felt it instantly, that prickling on the back of the neck, the unspoken message in every slow blink and sidelong glance. She moved through the aisle anyway, past the canned soup and boxed cereal. She kept her hands visible, arms loose at her sides, posture neutral. She'd been trained by the city to do this, to not give them a reason. She grabbed a soda and walked toward the register, already digging into her pocket for coins. Behind her, a voice snapped like a whip. "Hey, what'd you just put in your bag?" It was the woman from earlier in the store. Light skin, hair dyed blonde, face tight with suspicion. She pointed straight at Raina with one hand and gripped her purse with the other. "I saw her," she added quickly, turning to the officer. "She was fidgeting back there, probably slipped something in." Raina blinked, stunned. "I didn't take anything," she said, her voice low but steady. The cop moved fast, stepping between them like he was expecting a chase. "Ma'am, mind if I check your bag?" Raina held it out. He yanked it open, without waiting for her to respond. Cans of soup, a journal, a half-eaten pack of gum, her sketch pad, nothing else. Still, he dug through it, flipping open pages until he landed on the drawing, the face she'd sketched just hours earlier. His eyebrows raised, then narrowed. "Who's this?" Raina didn't answer. The woman folded her arms. "Probably her boyfriend," she sneered. Raina's stomach twisted. Her heart was beating fast, not with guilt, but with the sharp, familiar sting of being made small. This wasn't about the soda or the sketch. It was about control, about watching her squirm. Humiliation was the goal, not justice. "You're clear," the cop said after a beat, voice clipped. "Don't get jumpy next time." He said it like a warning, like she'd done something by simply existing where she wasn't supposed to. She took her bag, didn't buy the soda, and stepped back onto the sidewalk. The air outside hit hotter than before. The streetlight overhead buzzed, casting an uneven glow that cut through the shadows but didn't quite erase them. She walked, not fast, but not slow either. Her breath was tight, her face burned. That sketch had stayed in the cop's hand longer than anything else. He'd recognized the man. Not exactly, but enough to know the image mattered. Raina turned the corner, her thoughts rising like smoke. She was tired of the assumptions, of the rehearsed explanations, of the rules she followed to still be treated like a threat. She was tired of her face being enough to trigger alarm bells. She was 17, hungry, honest, and still, that wasn't enough. A city like this didn't need monsters to keep people down. It just needed suspicion. She stopped at the edge of a vacant lot and looked up at the dark sky. A plane blinked overhead, too far away to hear, and for a moment she wished she could float that high, away from all of it. And then she said it. Soft, to no one but the street. That man looked like he understood. The words disappeared into the noise. But in that whisper, something clicked. She wasn't the only one running from a lie. And maybe, just maybe, she wasn't the only one planning to fight back. The sun sat lower than usual, casting long gold streaks between the brick buildings as Raina crossed the same block where everything had started. The sidewalk still bore the same cracks. The same fast food wrappers danced on the breeze near the curb, but the air felt heavier now, more watchful. Every footstep sounded louder than it should have, even with cars crawling by and music drifting from passing windows. She didn't know exactly why she'd come back. Curiosity wasn't enough of an excuse. Neither was closure. Maybe it was something closer to instinct, or maybe it was the weight of what she'd seen, the silence in his stare, the undeniable truth in his shape, and the way that sketchbook image had stayed glued to the officer's attention longer than her own innocence had. The bench was still there, empty now. A crumpled paper bag sat on the ground beside it, flattened like it had been stepped on repeatedly. She hovered near it, eyes scanning the alley just behind the bus stop, that narrow space between two buildings that dipped into shadow. It wasn't smart to linger, especially not this late, especially not here, but she didn't move. Instead, she leaned on the post beside the bench and waited, like someone who knew something was supposed to return. And that's when she heard it. Footsteps behind her. Quick, light, not adult steps, sneakers, kids. She turned slightly and caught the tail end of a whisper. That's her. 3 boys stood half a block back, barely older than her, faces cocky with the kind of confidence that came from having nothing to lose. One wore a puffer vest despite the heat. Another had his hoodie pulled halfway over his head. The third dragged a baseball bat behind him, not raised, not threatening yet, just dragging for effect. She didn't flinch, but her breath shortened. They didn't run up. They strolled, slowly, like they owned the block. "You the one from TV?" one called out. "The poor little girl who saved a junkie?" Another one laughed. "She thinks she famous now?" Raina kept her hands at her sides, her back straight. "I don't know what you're talking about." The one with the bat tilted his head. "You look like you got attitude. Maybe we teach you to watch who you help." The words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. The threat was in the grin, the lazy shuffle forward, the distance shrinking. She backed up 1 step. Only one. Enough to let them know she was aware, but not afraid. Not yet. "You think you better than us?" The one in the vest sneered. "Walking around like your charity's gonna fix anything? Ain't nobody ever helped us." Raina didn't answer. There was nothing she could say that wouldn't be twisted. The bat clicked once against the sidewalk. The alley behind her now loomed large in her peripheral vision. She was boxed in, just enough to feel the trap tightening. But then, everything shifted. From the alley came a sound so small, so subtle, it almost didn't register at first. Just the scuff of a shoe against concrete. The three boys turned as one. He didn't charge. He didn't growl. He didn't say a word. He simply stepped forward, that same massive figure, cloaked in shadows, taller than any of them by a foot, broader than two of them side by side. His hoodie was up, his hands were at his sides, his eyes were fixed, not on Reyna, but on them. And he did nothing else. Just stared. The silence that followed felt nuclear. The boy with the bat took half a step back without meaning to. His hand faltered on the grip. The one in the vest whispered, "Io, what the hell?" They didn't wait for anything more. Whatever courage they'd built in their chest cracked instantly. Whether they recognized the face or just sensed the power, it didn't matter. They ran. Not all at once, but in a messy, uncoordinated scatter. The bat clanged to the pavement. A shout echoed into the street. Something about crazy, and I ain't messing with that. And then they were gone. Reyna stood still, her heartbeat finally catching up with the moment. The man Shaq remained where he was, one foot barely in the light now. He didn't move toward her, didn't nod, but she could see him clearly now. The same stature, the same silence, the glint of quiet recognition behind his hooded eyes. And she knew. There was no maybe left. It was him. His gaze lingered for only a second, before he turned and stepped back into the darkness of the alley. Not rushed, not theatrical, just gone, like he was never there at all. But she had seen him. And she was certain now he wasn't watching the world from shadows because he was weak. He was waiting, calculating. She stood there for another full minute, chest rising, adrenaline slowly unwinding itself. And when she finally walked away, she didn't look over her shoulder. She didn't have to. Somewhere out there, Big Shaq was moving again. And this time, it felt like he was watching more than just the streets. The city at sunrise looked soft from the outside. Gold spilling over rooftops, delivery trucks hissing to a halt, joggers pacing sidewalks like they owned the morning. But from the dark shell of the old West Side Rec Center, nothing looked soft. The glass in the windows was long gone, replaced with warped plywood and jagged openings that let in streaks of daylight and whispers of sound. It smelled like scorched wood and stale memories, but to Shaquille O'Neal, it was headquarters. He stood in what used to be the weight room, a place once filled with youth and steel and dreams. Now it was stripped bare. The floorboards had been torn open in places, giving way to a cavity beneath a hollow crawl space he'd converted into a vault of sorts, not for valuables but for truth. It was there beneath the rotting beams that he kept the things they hadn't managed to erase. Stacks of notebooks, spreadsheets printed with timestamps, and USB drives labeled with simple dates, each one a puzzle piece. They didn't look like much, but each file, each line item told a story of manipulation disguised as mentorship, control masked as investment. These weren't just documents, they were proof. Shaq hadn't set out to play detective. He'd trusted the wrong people once. Power suits who called him brother to his face, and sold him out behind closed doors. At first it was subtle. They'd started excluding him from meetings, quietly shifting terms in contracts, smiling while steering money into side ventures that bore his name but not his consent. But when he refused to sign off on a partnership with a real estate developer known for gentrifying black neighborhoods, the pressure escalated. And when he pushed back publicly, without permission, they made their move. Concerns about mental stability. That was the phrase they seeded into the media. All it took was one whisper, one anonymous source. From there it spread like rot. Now he moved through the burned-out building with precision. One camera tucked behind the vent shaft watched the alley. Another peered through a drilled hole in the boarded windows, aimed at the rec center parking lot. The surveillance system wasn't flashy, just stripped-down tech he rigged from discount store parts. But it worked. He had eyes on 4 blocks, and ears in 3 buildings. People underestimated how much could be gathered from what others threw away. Discarded phones, half-wiped hard drives. Shaq had learned to dig. He watched. He listened. He read every line of every email they'd sent him over the years, highlighting the language that shifted as soon as he started speaking for himself. One of the flash drives held screen captures from a group chat between investors, men he used to sit next to at charity galas and public events. The messages weren't just careless. They were cruel. Keep him close until the new deal signs. Then we freeze his voting rights. He's getting preachy again. Time to check the meds angle? Can we lean into the PTSD narrative? Maybe bring in a concerned family member? They hadn't just planned to silence him. They had plotted how to dismantle him while smiling in his face. He couldn't go to the press. Not yet. They wouldn't listen. Not while he looked like this. Scruffy, unshaven, too far from the clean suits and magazine covers they remembered. They'd call him bitter, say he was paranoid, dismiss his files as doctored or desperate. So he waited, watched, collected. He wasn't trying to clear his name. He was trying to expose the system that eats men like him alive the second they stop entertaining. Above the floorboards, the center remained quiet. Birds nested in the rafters. The occasional mouse scampered across forgotten tiles. But beneath it, Shaq traced wires, backed up files, sorted timestamps and logs. He had everything organized like a blueprint, because this wasn't just survival anymore. It was strategy. The girl had shaken something loose in him. Her gesture was small, $2 and no expectation. But it reminded him of who he used to be, who he still was underneath the layers of ash and betrayal. Her eyes didn't ask for anything. She just acted, like she saw the humanity in him before anything else. That's what they feared most. Not his strength, his influence. They were counting on him vanishing quietly, fading into the stereotype of the fallen black star. Another tragic tale of ego and delusion. But they'd underestimated one thing. Shaq wasn't just biding his time. He was building a case. A bomb made not of rage, but of receipts. A digital storm that would break wide open when the moment was right. Every file would land in the inboxes of the same networks that smeared him, the same boards that stripped his endorsements, the same voices that called him a liability. He'd let them try to spin it. Then he'd let the truth speak. The only thing that kept him from moving now was timing. Timing and caution. Because the moment he really reemerged, there would be more than headlines. There'd be damage control, pushback, maybe even threats. He knew what silence had bought him. But he also knew what truth could cost. As dusk filtered through the cracks in the wall, Shaq knelt beside the crawl space and placed the latest flash drive into a padded pouch. He slid the wood panel back into place, securing it with a rusted bracket. The gym may have been forgotten by the world, but it had become a sanctuary, not of peace, but of preparation. He stood, stretching his back. He was still sore, but not weak. Still quiet, but not invisible. Outside, the city moved in oblivion. Lights blinked on, horns blared, lives rushed forward unaware of what was coming. Shaq stepped toward the shadowed hallway, one hand brushing the old mural's remains. Just 3 figures left standing in color, their faces chipped but defiant. He whispered under his breath, not a prayer, but a promise. They think they buried me, but I've been watching every shovel. And with that, he vanished back into the dark. The knock on the door came just after noon. Sharp, professional, and out of place in a neighborhood where people usually called before they showed up. Raina was still in her sleep shirt, a cup of reheated coffee in her hand, when Daryl opened the door and immediately stiffened. 2 people stood on the porch. One held a microphone, the other a camera. A white woman in a clean blazer, smiling like she'd practiced every muscle in her face. Her voice carried the same cadence Raina recognized from the evening news, rehearsed empathy mixed with polished detachment. "We're from Channel 9, she said brightly, stepping forward before being invited in. "We heard about what happened on the bus earlier this week. Your niece Raina, is that her name?" Daryl squinted, not liking the way her name was already public currency. "What about her?" "We'd love to do a quick story, just a few minutes, highlighting her kindness, her bravery. It's a feel-good piece, really. Uplifting content, that's what people need right now." Raina heard the words from the kitchen and stepped into view. Her instinct said no, but curiosity kept her frozen. The woman turned her full attention to her, gaze sweeping over Raina like she was a prop to be placed just right in the frame. "We'd love to hear about the man you helped," the reporter said, still smiling. Such a powerful moment, so pure. Raina nodded slowly, unsure what to say. It hadn't felt pure. It had felt necessary, quiet, raw, but now it was being dressed in satin and sugar. Daryl muttered, "Ain't nobody need to be on TV." But the woman was already easing in with compliments. "You don't have to worry. We'll take care of editing. Just a quick interview. A few words about what it means to give back. The community will love it." The camera clicked on. A red light blinked. Raina sat down with her fingers curled in her lap, already knowing this was going to be a mistake. The questions came fast. What made you do it? What did the man look like? Did he seem dangerous at first? She answered carefully. He looked tired. That's all. He wasn't bothering anyone. I just paid. That's it. But they didn't want that. They wanted more. They wanted struggle, triumph, a packaged redemption arc. When she said the man didn't speak to her, the reporter smiled wider. "So you helped without even knowing if he was grateful? That's beautiful." Raina's mouth tightened. Later, when the segment aired, she watched it from the living room couch with a knot in her chest. Her image filled the screen, shoulders squared, voice calm, but something was missing. The edits were clean, the pauses cut, her words rearranged just enough to soften the edges. The anchor, a tall white man with salt and pepper hair, closed the story with a perfect bow. Sometimes, a good deed goes a long way. In neighborhoods like these, hope is more than a feeling. It's a young woman named Raina. The screen faded to a commercial for a pharmaceutical company. Raina stared at her reflection in the black glass of the TV. Hope? That's what they called it? They stripped her story of everything that mattered. The context, the tension, the silence. They hadn't mentioned that the man was black, that everyone on the bus had judged him, that she'd felt every stare burn into her skin. They made it look like a spontaneous miracle in a vacuum. They didn't talk about how she'd been profiled at the corner store days later, how she still had no idea where her next meal was coming from, how helping that man had cost her bus fare and maybe her safety. They made her a mascot, a smiling, sanitized version of what white audiences could handle. The worst part wasn't what they said. It was what they left out. Daryl turned off the TV with a grunt. They always do this, turn real into make-believe. Raina stood slowly, walking to her room without a word. She opened her sketchbook again, flipping past the drawing of the man, past the rough outlines of the alley, until she landed on a blank page. And this time she didn't draw him. She drew the reporter. She sketched her teeth too white, eyes too sharp, her microphone like a weapon. Then she drew the anchor, shoulders squared, smile stiff. Around them, she added blurred faces, the viewers, the audience that clapped from behind screens without ever knowing what it cost to be inspiring. She titled the page, "Permission to Care," sold separately. Later that night, her inbox pinged. It was a message from someone at a media firm. They'd seen her story and wanted to talk next steps. She deleted it without reading. They wanted to brand her now, package her goodness, maybe a scholarship if she said the right thing at the right gala, maybe an award. But all she wanted was to be seen as she was, not the version they dressed her up to be. She thought of Shaq again. Wherever he was, she knew he had watched the same kind of people twist his truth, and now they were trying to do it to her. But not this time. The next story would be hers. No edits, no scripts. The studio lights were bright, and the set was cold, the kind of artificial chill that came from too many wires and too much control. But Lucille O'Neill didn't flinch beneath the glare. She sat in a high-backed chair across from the host, her posture straight, hands folded, her expression unreadable. Dignity wrapped her like armor, soft-spoken, but with a presence that silenced the room more than any shouted word could. The program had teased the segment for days. Exclusive interview with the mother of the missing NBA legend. Cameras had been adjusted, mics fine-tuned, and producers briefed on every possible direction, but none of them were prepared for what she would say. Across the city, televisions blinked to the channel. In living rooms, barbershops, diners, and security guard booths, eyes turned to the screen. The country wanted a scandal or a tearful plea. They wanted a narrative they could hold, missing or mentally gone, fallen from grace or buried by guilt. What they got was none of that. Lucille didn't offer comfort. She didn't weep. She didn't ask for privacy or demand justice. She offered a sentence. "My son didn't run," she said, her voice even, her gaze firm. "He's rising." That was it. No elaboration. No explanation. She left the words to hang there, suspended in that sterile studio air, more potent than any exposé. And when the host leaned forward, trying to pull more from her with a gentle, rehearsed "What exactly do you mean by that?" she just smiled. Not politely, not smugly, but like a woman who had already buried all the nonsense and stood with her back to the grave. The clip went viral within the hour. On the surface, it was nothing. A mother defending her son. But to those watching closely, it was something else. It wasn't grief in her voice. It was conviction. It wasn't hope. It was certainty. And Raina heard it like a shot through glass. She was in her room when the segment aired, leaning against the windowsill, earbuds in but no music playing. Daryl called to her from the other room. "Hey, his mama's on Channel 7. She pulled out the earbuds and turned up the volume. She watched Lucille speak, and felt something shift inside her. That line, "He's rising," was more than a defense. It was a signal. Raina sat frozen in the dim light, her mind replaying every moment she'd shared with the man on the bus. The silence, the sighs, the weight behind his eyes, the way the news had painted him as vanished, broken, unstable, but never once asked what pushed him into the shadows. They didn't need to ask. They had the story they wanted. But Lucille cracked it open. Raina looked down at her sketch pad, flipping again to the drawing of the hooded man. It wasn't just a figure anymore. It was a truth she could no longer ignore. The man wasn't hiding from guilt. He was hiding from a lie. And she had helped him without knowing who he was. That realization rattled her. It wasn't the fame that struck her now. It was the weight of what he was carrying. What they had tried to bury under layers of press releases and slanted coverage. Shaquille O'Neal wasn't gone. He was watching. Planning. Waiting for the city to speak louder than the headlines. And now, thanks to Lucille, it was. Neighborhoods buzzed. Rumors ignited. On every block, someone had a theory. Some said he was sick, moving through cities like a ghost. Others whispered about sightings, at a gas station, near an abandoned gym, stepping onto a city bus in a gray hoodie. His myth was growing by the minute. But to Raina, he wasn't a myth. He was real. And she knew the truth. He hadn't disappeared. He had simply chosen not to perform anymore. She thought of the white anchor who had called her a symbol of hope, how quickly they tried to make stories out of people without understanding the price, and now they were doing the same to him, narrating his fall without questioning the push. Lucille's words burned through the noise. "He's rising." Raina whispered the line to herself. It didn't sound like prophecy. It sounded like strategy. The next morning, when she walked to the store, she saw the change. A group of men huddled on a stoop, phones out, sharing the clip. A kid on a bike had chalked "He's rising" on the sidewalk outside the library. Someone had spray-painted a silhouette of a man in a hoodie on the alley wall near the bus stop, the words "You saw me" stenciled beneath it. The streets were speaking now. And they weren't speaking in hashtags or trending topics. They were speaking in memory. In defiance. In truth. Raina stopped near the mural, her eyes scanning the figure. It wasn't perfect. The proportions were off. The paint dripped, but the feeling was exact. She stood there a long time, letting the wind whip through her hoodie. He wasn't just rising. He was returning. The press room was already packed when the double doors opened. Photographers crowded shoulder to shoulder, lenses raised like weapons. Network vans lined the streets outside, their satellites tilted skyward as if trying to catch a signal bigger than any broadcast. The podium at the front was empty, an emblem of uncertainty and anticipation, and for 20 straight minutes all anyone did was speculate. Until he walked in. There was no grand entrance, no security escort, no thundering music or announcement. Just a door swinging open, and Shaquille O'Neal stepping into the frame, clean-shaven, suit tailored sharp and dark, eyes steady. He moved with the calmness of a man who had watched the storm circle for too long, and finally stepped into its center. The silence that followed his entrance wasn't one of reverence. It was shock. Because this man, standing composed under harsh lights, was not the broken figure they had tried to paint. He wasn't disoriented, he wasn't unraveling, and most importantly, he wasn't apologizing. He took the podium slowly, placing a single folder on its surface. He didn't shuffle papers or search for words. He looked out at the crowd like he already knew every question they were going to ask, and none of them mattered. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower than it used to be, measured, but it carried like thunder. "There's a difference between being silent," he began, "and being silenced." The room leaned forward. "Over the last year, I've been portrayed as missing, unstable, dangerous, not because I lost my mind, but because I refused to lose my voice." He opened the folder. Inside were 3 tabs. He didn't raise them for the cameras. He didn't flash evidence like a magician. He simply began listing names, dates, transactions, boardroom decisions, partnerships turned sabotage, emails stripped of pleasantries and full of implications. He cited financial reports tied to city contracts that never reached the communities they claimed to serve. He exposed shell companies under philanthropic brands. He played a short audio clip, just 15 seconds, of an executive joking in a boardroom. "Let Shaq talk all he wants. At the end of the day, he's just a mascot in a suit." The silence in the room grew deeper. Then he presented the contracts, highlighted clauses added without his consent, redirected funds, political donors with backdoor influence, and the worst, internal memos from former partners strategizing how to discredit him if he spoke out. Every sentence landed like a hammer. Not just because it was real, but because it was undeniable. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't point fingers. He didn't posture. He presented, fact by fact, one by one, until the wall of myth that had been built around his disappearance cracked wide open, and people saw what lay beneath. Not a fallen giant, but a man pushed underground for refusing to play by the rules that silenced too many before him. And then when the questions began to bubble up, when the journalists tried to process the scale of what had just been laid out, Shaq paused. He closed the folder and looked up again. "This didn't start in a boardroom," he said. "It didn't start with billion-dollar deals. It started on a city bus, sitting next to a girl who didn't look at me with fear or judgment. She looked at me like I was human." The cameras zoomed in. The air thickened. She gave me her last $2. No questions, no agenda, just kindness. He didn't name her, not once. He didn't describe her face, or where it happened, or what route they were on. He didn't need to. Most people are taught to look past what they don't understand. But she looked right at me and didn't flinch. That moment reminded me who I was. Not what they said, not what they tried to twist. Who I actually am. He stepped back from the podium. Not in retreat, but in release. He had said what he came to say. No scripted statement. No pre-approved soundbite. Just truth. Then he turned and walked out. And the room erupted, not with applause but with noise. Scrambling journalists. Phones dialing lawyers and editors. Emails drafted in a rush. Social media buzzed like a live wire. Video clips were uploaded before he made it to the building's back door. Within minutes, Shaq's return trended globally. But he was already gone. No interviews. No follow-up. No press tour. Outside the venue, a crowd had started to gather. Some held signs. Others just stared in disbelief as he passed them without a word. He moved through them like smoke, visible, present, untouchable. Across the city, Raina watched it unfold on Daryl's ancient laptop, the stream lagging every few seconds. She sat on the edge of her bed, eyes wide, heart caught in her throat. He hadn't said her name, but she knew. The $2 the moment, the memory. He remembered her, not for who she was on the outside, not for the version the news had painted, but for the quiet thing they shared. Recognition. Daryl leaned in over her shoulder, stunned. That man ain't lost. That man's a reckoning. Raina said nothing. She was still processing. Not just the speech, not just the headlines, but what it meant to help someone without knowing the scale of what they were carrying, and how that one silent act dismissed by the world had become part of a turning tide. She walked outside, the wind soft on her face. Down the block, a group of kids chalked his name on the sidewalk again. This time, they added something new. He rose, and we're rising too. Raina smiled barely, then turned and kept walking forward. The street hadn't changed much. The cracks in the pavement were still there, tracing old patterns like scars. The corner store still buzzed with its flickering neon sign, and the same faded posters curled at the edges on the community board by the laundromat. The city still pulsed with that same tension, too loud in some places, too silent in others. But something in the air felt different now, lighter, looser, like something once clenched had finally unclenched. Raina walked with her hood down, head up, headphones around her neck but no music playing. She didn't need the noise to guard her anymore. She wanted to hear it all. The arguments, the street traffic, the clink of soda cans being kicked down alleys. It was the same city, but now she met its stare with her own. People still looked at her, but not all of them looked away. She passed a group of boys hanging out by the bus stop. Same spot, same graffiti-tagged bench. But when one of them made a joke too loud, another nudged him quiet. Their eyes flicked toward her, then down. A small gesture, nothing loud, but enough to tell her the story had reached them too. On the opposite side of the street, a pair of older men sat on milk crates, watching a live stream replay of Shaq's press conference on a cracked tablet propped against a fire hydrant. The volume was low, but his voice still cut through. Raina heard the moment clearly as she passed. She gave me her last $2. She didn't stop walking, but she smiled to herself. Just a little. Inside the barber shop, the TVs were all tuned to different news stations now. Shaq's speech played on repeat, commentators scrambling to catch up to the truth they'd ignored. And for once, the headlines weren't trying to bury him. They were chasing him. Her uncle Daryl sat in his recliner with his hand covering his mouth, eyes glassy. He hadn't said much all morning, just watched, rewound and watched again. She found him like that when she got home. TV flickering, coffee untouched, and the remote clutched too tight. "He ain't just talking," he finally said as she walked past. "He teaching him how to listen." Raina didn't reply. She didn't need to. He could see it in her face. She stepped back outside, letting the screen door creak shut behind her. All around the neighborhood, chalk murals had bloomed on sidewalks, some with the silhouette of the man in the hoodie, others with his name scrawled beneath phrases like "not missing moving," or they tried to silence him. The most common one, though, was the line Lucille had gifted the world. "He's rising." But the city wasn't just watching Shaq now. It was watching itself. Conversations had begun where silence once lived, at school drop-offs, at bus stops, in the corners of break rooms. Small, uncomfortable questions whispered between friends. Why did we believe the headlines so fast? Why do we wait for permission to care? The change wasn't tidal. It wasn't sudden. But it was real. Raina passed the mural wall again. Someone had added a second figure beside the hoodie silhouette. Smaller, female, outlined in gold. No name, no caption, just presence. She stared at it longer this time. For all the coverage, no one had figured out who the girl on the bus was. Shaq hadn't told them. He hadn't needed to. He'd given her something better than recognition. He gave her privacy wrapped in power. He'd let her keep her story while still lifting the truth. She hadn't helped a stranger. She had reminded a giant that he was still a man. And in return, he reminded the world how quickly it tries to crush those who stand too tall without bowing. At the bus stop, a young mother with a stroller nodded to Raina as she approached. Not out of recognition, just respect. That hadn't happened before. A few feet away, an elderly man with a worn cane pointed to the bench and said, "Funny, right here. This where he was, ain't it?" Raina just nodded. He grinned. Always said this city is too quick to forget who it owes. She sat on the bench after he left, letting her fingers run across the worn metal armrest. The sun cut through the clouds, warm on her skin. No crowd, no fanfare, just a pause. Somewhere Shaq was still moving, still planning, still watching the empire that had tried to erase him now scramble to remember who he was. But he didn't need a throne. He had his truth. And truth, once seen, doesn't unsee itself. Back home, Daryl finally wiped his eyes. She'd never seen him cry, not once, not for anything. But he didn't try to hide it. He watched the last moments of the press conference again. Shaq's voice softer now as he said, "You don't need a cape, just enough heart to not look away." And that's how it ended. Not with fireworks. Not with revenge. But with a city beginning to see. One person at a time. If this story made you pause, it wasn't fiction doing the work. It was truth wearing a new coat. Ask yourself, who do we ignore, and who do we choose to see? The world doesn't change through noise. It changes when someone dares to notice. Stay awake. Stay watching. Because the next story might already be sitting beside you.